Welcome to the debate. When we think about upgrading human civilization, there is often this quiet expectation of precision.
Yeah, like we want it to work like a software patch.
Exactly. Your computer's running slow, there's a bug in the code, so you download an update, you install it, the system reboots, and you're good to go. It's clean, it's binary, and it's immediate.
Right, and it's incredibly comforting to look at the world that way. I mean, we desperately want to believe that societal progress can be just as visible.
Oh, absolutely.
Like you just identify the bad code, let's say war, poverty, or cruelty, and you simply overwrite it with better logic.
Right. But today, we are diving into a text that forces us to confront why that software analogy completely breaks down when applied to humanity. We are exploring the conceptual foundation of the blueprint of a peaceful world, and specifically, we are focusing our entire analysis purely on its preamble.
And it's a dense, fascinating piece of writing.
It really is. The text diagnoses our current existential crisis as the Promethean Gap. And if you're wondering what that means, think of the Greek myth of Prometheus, who stole fire from the gods.
The idea being that we now possess godlike Promethean technology, right?
Exactly. Nuclear fission, artificial intelligence, bioengineering, but we are trying to manage all of that while still running on hardware that is millions of years old. We are driven by Paleolithic emotions.
Which makes for a profoundly murky, highly dangerous existential landscape. We have the weapons of gods, but the brains of hunter-gatherers.
Yeah. And to survive this bottleneck, the preamble proposes a radical, almost audacious framework, engineering conscious evolution. And the mechanism it proposes for this is something it calls enterprise-grade peacebuilding.
A fascinating phrase.
I take the position today that the preamble provides a highly credible, remarkably actionable roadmap. It roots its thesis in what it calls the common heritage of humanity.
Which is a mix of different philosophical streams, right?
Right, specifically a synthesis of scientific rationalism and our biological reality. By combining our natural predisposition for empathy with highly scalable, enterprise-grade systems, think the logistics of a multinational corporation applied to peace, we can actually shift the Overton window.
Meaning we can change what society considers acceptable.
Exactly. We can make a world entirely without war the new, undeniable reality.
Well, and I take the opposing stance. While I deeply agree with the text's diagnosis of the Promethean Gap, and, I respect its beautiful synthesis of spiritual wisdom and philosophical humanism, I fundamentally challenge its core assumption.
Which assumption?
The assumption that our Paleolithic emotions can be systematically managed or engineered out of human behavior via high-tech infrastructure. The concept of an evolutionary mismatch presents a much darker paradox than the preamble admits.
How so?
Treating peacebuilding like a scalable tech platform, optimizing morality as if it were a supply chain, it risks being an overly technocratic simplification of human nature. I think it underestimates the deeply entrenched irrational use of violence as a survival tool.
Okay, I want to unpack the biology first, because if you are listening to this and thinking, wait, human nature is inherently peaceful? Have you looked at a history book? The text anticipates that exact skepticism.
It definitely does.
The preamble leans heavily on what it calls the anthropological norm. It points to empirical biology, complex cooperation, and our innate biophilia, our love for living things, are actually our default settings.
And they ground this in neurology, don't they?
Yes, specifically mirror neurons. This isn't just philosophical wishing.
Right, those are the cells that fire both when we act and when we observe the same action performed by someone else.
Precisely. If I watch you accidentally hit your thumb with a hammer, my brain's pain centers light up. I physically flinch. We are hardwired to simulate and experience the suffering of others. The text argues that in normal development, a human child possesses a physiological aversion to violence. Therefore, our current state of perpetual systemic war is an aberration. It's a structural failure.
But an aberration caused by what?
Well, the preamble argues that this internal biological compass is only broken by two specific things: profound trauma or calculated propaganda. War only happens when we are artificially conditioned to accept it.
I see.
So we do not have to invent a new, magical, peaceful human being. We just have to stop breaking the ones we already have.
I don't dispute the existence of mirror neurons, nor do I deny that we have a capacity for deep empathy. But if we truly possess these Paleolithic emotions that create the Promethean Gap in the first place, doesn't that inherently include the survival instincts that drive preemptive violence?
It includes survival instincts, sure.
But let me just pose a very uncomfortable question here. If our biological baseline is overwhelmingly peaceful, and if war is merely an aberration broken by propaganda, where did the propaganda come from? Who created the trauma?
Well, we did, certainly.
Exactly. Human beings did. We invented the trauma. We invented the propaganda.
Yes, but
If our nature is as inherently peaceful as the anthropological norm suggests, how did the Promethean Gap open so widely to begin with? Tribalism, the dividing of the world into an us and a them for the sake of resource competition, is just as deeply embedded in our Paleolithic emotions as empathy is.
I'm not denying tribalism exists.
But empathy, from an evolutionary standpoint, was historically reserved for the in-group. You protect your tribe so your genes survive. But applying that empathy universally to all 8 billion people on the planet, that goes against the very grain of the evolutionary mismatch the text identifies.
I see why you think that, but let me give you a different perspective. Evolution is not static, and the text uses the stream of scientific rationalism to prove this.
Okay.
Life develops from primitive competition to complex cooperation, and eventually to symbiosis.
Symbiosis meaning two separate organisms merging to create a single new higher-functioning organism. Like how mitochondria were once independent bacteria before merging with complex cells.
Exactly. It's the ultimate form of cooperation, and we see this mirrored in human social evolution. We have already expanded our circle of empathy drastically.
You mean historically?
Yes. 10,000 years ago, your empathy was strictly for your immediate family. Then it expanded to the tribe, then to the city-state, then to the massive nation-state.
Right.
We are currently cooperating in blocks of hundreds of millions of people who have never even met each other. The text is simply arguing that we are ready for the next phase transition, conscious evolution to the species level.
And how exactly do we manage that transition?
That's the key here. The preamble doesn't ask us to achieve this by just hoping everyone suddenly feels empathetic. It demands we build the infrastructure to support it.
And this is where we have to look very closely at the nuts and bolts. If I am conceding that empathy is biological, scaling a biological feeling to 8 billion people without it breaking down requires a massive mechanism.
It absolutely does.
The preamble explicitly acknowledges that past peace efforts have failed because of weak marketing, amateur organization, and a lack of scalability. So its proposed solution is what it calls enterprise-grade peacebuilding.
Yes, the creation of a next-generation high-tech NGO.
Which sounds incredibly corporate, honestly. The text proposes an open-source social operating system. It wants to use big data, AI, and rely on corporate metrics like ESG principles, environmental, social, and governance, and SROI, social return on investment.
And I find that structural self-awareness to be the preamble's most brilliant stroke.
Really? You don't find it a bit sterile?
Not at all. Think about how we currently operate. We have historically treated peace like a weekend charity project, a hobby. Meanwhile, war operates like a multinational conglomerate.
Well, that's undeniably true.
The military-industrial complex has supply chains, massive research and development budgets, logistics, and rigid metrics for success. The preamble is asking a very pragmatic question. Why should the infrastructure of death be enterprise-grade, while the infrastructure of life is left to amateurs with good intentions?
But how does an ESG principle or a social return on investment actually stop a conflict?
By treating peace as a highly managed, quantifiable endeavor. Let's look at one of the specific metrics the text mentions, a dehumanization index.
Okay, explain how that works in practice.
We know historically that dehumanization always precedes the gunshot. It is a sociological process. Before a group is attacked, the opposing side begins using specific metaphors in their language.
Calling them pests, diseases, or vermin?
Yes. Now imagine using big data and AI to monitor social media and public broadcasts in a volatile region. If the AI detects a spike in the velocity of dehumanization language, the dehumanization index flashes red.
So it's an early warning system.
Exactly. You don't wait for the shooting to start. The next-gen NGO instantly deploys resources, pedagogical practices, dialogue facilitators, economic incentives before the trauma occurs. You are using an enterprise-grade mechanism to protect the biological norm of peace.
That's a compelling argument, but have you considered the inherent philosophical contradiction here?
What contradiction?
The preamble also deeply roots itself in what it calls philosophical humanism. The core of humanism, drawing on Kant's categorical imperative, is the demand that we always treat humanity as an end in itself and never merely as a means to an end.
Of course. The preamble explicitly values the sacred inviolability of human life.
Then let me offer an analogy. Can we truly optimize human morality the way a logistics company optimizes a corporate supply chain for shipping sneakers?
I don't think that's a fair comparison.
But when you reduce the profound, messy, existential transformation of the human soul to terms like social marketing, SROI, and ESG principles, do you not risk stripping away the very spiritual wisdom the text claims to champion?
Not if it works.
You cannot quantify a spiritual awakening on a dashboard. By turning peace into data points, by reducing citizens to a dehumanization index, we risk treating humans exactly as a means. They become a means to achieve a green light on an NGO's metric dashboard.
I strongly disagree with that framing. A metric is not a reduction of the human soul. It is a vital diagnostic tool to protect the human soul.
It just feels very cold.
If you're listening to this and thinking an open-source social operating system sounds like a terrifying sci-fi dystopia, you aren't alone. The phrasing does sound cold, but let's look at the reality of how structural support works.
I'm listening.
Think of it like the history of public health. In the 19th century, people in major cities were dying of cholera. We didn't solve cholera by asking people to organically develop stronger immune systems.
No, we didn't.
We didn't solve it by asking them to achieve spiritual purity so they wouldn't get sick.
We built modern sanitation.
Exactly. We built an enterprise-grade sewer system. We changed the plumbing of the cities. The preamble is proposing the exact same thing, but for peace.
That's an interesting way to look at it.
It's the clean water. But you need the open-source social operating system to distribute that water globally without it getting contaminated by the propaganda we talked about earlier.
Okay, I see the logic.
We aren't outsourcing morality to an algorithm. We are building the pipes so that morality can actually reach everyone.
That is a fascinating analogy, the plumbing of peace. But here is the flaw in the metaphor.
Go ahead.
Cholera is a bacterium. Violence is a human choice. You can physically separate humans from bacteria using iron pipes. You cannot separate humans from their own Paleolithic emotions with a social operating system, no matter how much big data it processes.
But you can manage the environment that triggers those emotions.
A sewer system moves physical waste. It does not rewire the psychological desire to dominate, to hoard, or to fear the unknown. Which brings me to the fundamental theory of change in the preamble. How does this text actually believe we're going to shift global reality?
It relies heavily on sociology, specifically the Thomas theorem, the law of defining reality.
Yes, the text quotes the theorem. If men define situations as real, they are real in their consequences.
Exactly. The preamble argues that the belief in the inevitability of war acts as a massive self-fulfilling prophecy. Because we believe war is a permanent fixture of human nature, we build weapons.
And because we build weapons, we inevitably use them.
Right. The preamble says that if we can consciously shift the Overton window, the range of ideas the public is willing to accept, and collectively define a world without murder as the new normal, that definition will begin to shape our institutions and our literal reality.
And to justify this, the text points to historical precedent.
Undeniable historical precedent. The preamble notes that institutions like slavery, systemic torture, and human sacrifice were all once considered unshakable, eternal laws of nature.
People honestly thought human society would collapse economically and socially without them.
But they became things of the past. Why? Because of a massive shift in ethical norms. Society redefined its reality. The preamble logically concludes that war is next on this list.
assuming we use this new infrastructure.
Yes. Once we use our enterprise-grade NGO infrastructure to actively shift the Overton window, the reality of war will collapse just like the reality of institutional slavery did.
I'm sorry, but I just don't buy that. Let me tell you why. By all means, the historical precedent of abolishing slavery is a powerful narrative, but it is deeply incomplete when you try to map it onto the abolition of war.
How is it incomplete? They are both massive ethical shifts.
Yes, moral definitions shifted, but slavery was fundamentally an economic system that was eventually outcompeted by the Industrial Revolution. Furthermore, the abolition of slavery often required massive state violence to achieve.
Like the American Civil War?
Exactly. The American Civil War is a prime example. It was an incredibly bloody conflict to end an unethical system.
But that is the old paradigm of solving problems with violence. The Promethean Gap requires a new paradigm.
My point is that the preamble itself admits that today, murder on a mass scale is still deeply justified globally as the price of security. It is a tool of geopolitics. War isn't just a bad habit, and it isn't just an outdated belief system.
It's a survival tactic.
Right. When a sovereign nation faces an existential threat, the use of the weapons of gods guarantees their immediate physical survival. Shifting the Overton window to make war unthinkable requires overcoming deeply entrenched geopolitical power structures.
Structures that rely on the threat of violence to maintain their borders.
Exactly. An open-source social OS, no matter how scalable or metrics-driven, lacks the coercive mechanism to force a rogue, nuclear-armed state to lay down its arms. The Thomas theorem works beautifully for social constructs. It does not stop a tank crossing a border.
But you are missing the mechanism of how the definition of reality strips the tank of its power. That is exactly why the text calls for the awakening of the moral imagination.
A moral imagination doesn't stop armor plating.
You are looking at the tank and saying a metric can't stop its treads. The preamble is looking at the human beings building the tank, funding the tank, and driving the tank. And it's saying we can change their definition of reality.
But the state still needs to survive.
You mentioned that states use war as a rational survival calculation. But the preamble explicitly argues that in the era of the Promethean Gap, war is no longer rational. It is suicide.
Because of the nuclear and technological stakes.
Right. A tribal skirmish with spears had a natural geographical limit. A skirmish with autonomous drone swarms and biological weapons threatens the very existence of the species. Ethics is no longer a philosophical luxury here.
It's a necessity.
The text explicitly states it is a fundamental law of survival. We cannot afford the luxury of pessimism.
Look, I entirely agree that it threatens the species, but again, evolutionary mismatch means we do not naturally think on the level of the species.
We have to learn to.
But our brains are not wired to comprehend 8 billion people. When terrified, we think on the level of the immediate tribe. We hoard resources, we build walls, we build tanks.
Which is exactly why the preamble's synthesis of the common heritage of humanity is so vital. It's not just relying on one single approach.
It's blending them.
Yes. It is spiritual wisdom giving us the sacred, inviolable nature of life. It is philosophical humanism giving us the ethical imperative to treat people as ends, never means.
Right.
It is scientific rationalism showing us that symbiosis and cooperation are the only evolutionary paths forward. And it is the anthropological norm providing the neurological, biological foundation to build upon.
That is a very comprehensive summary of the preamble's framework.
If you combine all four of those streams and you scale them with enterprise-grade efficiency, tracking the data, anticipating the trauma, funding the peace builders like we fund militaries, you absolutely can shift the collective definition of reality.
You think that's enough to make the tank obsolete?
Yes. You make the tank obsolete because the global social consensus simply refuses to fund it, build it, or drive it.
That right there is the ultimate test of conscious evolution. Can we consciously, willfully, decide to outgrow our own Paleolithic instincts through sheer structural engineering?
The preamble believes we can.
The preamble offers a beautiful, intellectually rigorous vision, but I remain concerned that by framing the abolition of war as an engineering problem, something to be solved with dashboards, metrics, scaling, and operational systems, we might be whistling past the graveyard of human irrationality.
You think it's too optimistic?
I think the Promethean Gap isn't just a lack of good social plumbing. It is a profound darkness in the human capacity for destruction, a darkness that might require more than a next-generation NGO to heal.
Yet, to do nothing, to accept that we are permanent slaves to our Paleolithic hardware, is to accept inevitable self-destruction. The preamble refuses to do that.
That was just true.
It gives us a tangible, non-magical mechanism to close the Promethean Gap. It relies on our proven biological capacity for symbiogenesis, coupled with the exact same enterprise-grade infrastructure that built the modern, interconnected world.
It certainly aims high.
It is an incredibly actionable synthesis. It gives us a real way to redefine reality, shift the Overton window, and make a world without war the new permanent baseline.
Well, we certainly share common ground in acknowledging that the Promethean Gap is the defining existential threat of our era.
Absolutely.
And I must commend the preamble for its unique, sweeping fusion of ideas. Bringing together scientific rationalism, spiritual wisdom, and philosophical humanism into a single cohesive framework is no small feat.
It forces us to look in the mirror, doesn't it?
It forces us to confront our evolutionary mismatch head-on. My reservations remain deeply rooted in the technocratic execution. The idea of solving ancient Paleolithic emotions with tech startup methodologies. But the diagnosis of our illness is undeniably acute.
And that is exactly the value of interrogating these root operating systems of thought. There is so much more nuance to explore in the preamble's vision of conscious evolution.
There really is. We've barely scratched the surface.
We invite everyone listening to dive into the text for themselves. Examine the 4 streams of the common heritage. Look closely at the metrics of enterprise-grade peacebuilding.
And decide for yourself if the Thomas theorem can truly manifest a reality where peace is the norm.
Because ultimately, whether we like it or not, we are all still running that ancient hardware.
The question is whether we can install a new, species-wide operating system before the current one crashes for good.
Exactly. When you step into the realm of human evolution, there are no simple binary software patches. The evolutionary hardware is ancient, and the Promethean Gap is terrifyingly wide.
But there is hope.
If the preamble is right, the code for peace is already written in our biology. We just have to build the enterprise bold enough to run it.